For 30 years, a man walked into some of the wealthiest rooms in America wearing a name that wasn't his. He convinced bankers, socialites, and even a prestigious Boston club that he was born into old money. But underneath every name he used, there was a much older secret buried in a backyard in California, and for nearly a decade, nobody even knew a crime had happened at all. If the kind of story that keeps you up wondering how someone could get away with something for this long is the kind of story you like drifting off to, then this channel is probably a good place for you to settle in. Go ahead and subscribe, tap the notification bell, and leave a like if you want more of these before bed mysteries to show up when you need them. But for now, let's get back to it. In 1978, immigration officers at JFK Airport processed a 17-year-old boy arriving alone from Germany. He told them an American family had offered to let him stay with them while he attended school in the United States. That wasn't exactly true. He had actually met a family on a train back in Germany, a casual conversation, the kind people forget the moment they step off. They'd mentioned, almost as a courtesy, that if he ever found himself in Berlin, Connecticut, he was welcome to stop by. He took that offer and turned it into a plan. When he showed up at their door months later, the family had no idea he was coming. And somehow, he talked his way into staying with them for months, presenting himself as a foreign exchange student. That pattern, showing up somewhere he didn't belong and talking his way into staying, would define the next 30 years of his life. By the early 80s, he was living with that Connecticut family, and those who knew him back then said he had one strange obsession. He wanted to be Thurston Howell III, the fictional millionaire from Gilligan's Island. He practiced the accent. He practiced the mannerisms. He wanted, more than anything, to sound like old money. After a brief stop in Wisconsin, where he married someone in order to get a green card, using his real name for what would turn out to be one of the last times, he moved to California. And in San Marino, an affluent community near Pasadena, he introduced himself under a brand new name, Christopher Chichester. He told people he was a film student. He told people he had English royal blood. And to build trust quickly, he did something clever. He volunteered at a well-regarded Episcopal church in the community, the kind of place where people vouch for each other without asking too many questions. He also needed somewhere to live, and he found it in the backyard of a woman named Dee Sohus. She rented him a small guest house on her property. Her son and daughter-in-law, John and Linda Sohus, lived in the main house with her. For a while, everything seemed fine. He audited classes at the USC Film School. He even talked a local public television station into giving him his own program. To the people around him, he was an eccentric but charming young man with expensive tastes and a mysterious background. But John Sohus started noticing something. He began asking questions about his mother's tenant. Who was this guy, really? And why did it seem like he was spending Dee Dee's money on nice clothes? Those questions never got answered. Because in 1985, John and his wife Linda suddenly vanished. When people asked where they'd gone, the tenant had an explanation ready. He said the couple had been called away suddenly to Europe for urgent business. It was vague, but at the time, nobody had a reason to push back on it. And here's the detail that mattered most. Even though almost nobody clocked it in the moment, shortly after John and Linda disappeared, so did Christopher Chichester. He didn't go far, though. By the end of 1985, he resurfaced in Connecticut, the same state he'd started out in years earlier, under yet another name, Christopher Crow. And in an odd little detail that would only make sense much later, he tried to sell a car, specifically John Sohus's car, without proper registration. Settling into Greenwich, Connecticut, he told people he was a television producer from Los Angeles, someone who had worked on the 80s revival of Alfred Hitchcock Presents. It was a believable story, partly because the name he'd chosen happened to match the name of an actual producer who'd worked on that very show. He got a job at a brokerage firm working with their computers. That ended when someone checked his social security number and discovered it belonged to David Berkowitz, the convicted serial killer known as the Son of Sam. That's not the kind of mistake that goes unnoticed. He was let go. He landed at another firm after that, working in corporate bond sales, and was fired from that one too. Then he took a position at a third firm, Kidder, Peabody. This time, he left on his own, walking away from the name Christopher Crowe entirely right around the time he discovered that police were asking questions about the disappearance of a young couple back in California. In 1988, he was pulled over while driving a distinctive green van in Connecticut. The van was registered to John Sohus. At the time, this stop didn't lead anywhere. No connection was made. No alarm bells rang. It was filed away as nothing. By 1992, he had reinvented himself again, and this time he aimed higher than he ever had before. He began telling people his name was Clark Rockefeller, specifically a member of a lesser-known branch of the famous Rockefeller family. It was the perfect story for the social circles he wanted to move in because it explained away anything odd about him. Eccentric behavior, vague answers about his past, expensive tastes with no visible source of income, all of it could be waved off with a single word: old money. In 1993, at a cocktail party in New York, he met a woman named Sandra Boss. She was smart, accomplished, on her way to becoming a senior partner at a major consulting firm. And she fell for the charming young Rockefeller. In 1994, back in San Marino, California, construction workers were installing a swimming pool for the new owners of a property. As they dug into the yard, they found human remains buried in the ground. It was a disturbing discovery, but at that point, there was no name attached to the bones, and certainly no connection drawn to a wealthy man living on the East Coast under a completely different identity. The following year, in 1995, Clark Rockefeller married Sandra Boss in a Quaker ceremony, a ceremony that, notably, carried limited legal standing. The two of them built a life together, eventually settling in Cornish, New Hampshire, with their daughter. He told friends and neighbors he was a wealthy Yale graduate who owned a company up in Canada. He leaned on the Rockefeller name constantly, using it to open doors, to earn trust, to secure membership in Boston's exclusive Algonquin Club, where he spent a great deal of his time. For over a decade, this life held. But in 2006, Sandra Boss hired a private investigator. What she found unsettled her deeply. Her husband was not who he claimed to be. She didn't yet know his real name. She didn't know about California or Connecticut or any of the identities that came before Clark Rockefeller. But she knew enough to understand that the man she'd married was built entirely out of fiction. That discovery led to a divorce and a custody arrangement that gave him only supervised visits with their daughter. In April of 2008, he resigned from his role as a director at the Algonquin Club. Something was shifting. Then, on July 27, 2008, during one of those court-supervised visits in Boston, he did something drastic. He took his 7-year-old daughter and disappeared with her all the way to Baltimore, Maryland. It turned out he'd been planning this for a while. He already had an apartment waiting there and a brand new identity ready to go: Chip Smith, yacht captain. For nearly a week, federal investigators searched for the man and the girl, and the country watched a manhunt unfold for someone who, by then, had used more names than most people can remember. Now let me walk you through what investigators eventually pieced together, because once they caught up to him, the truth unraveled fast, and it went back much further than anyone expected. On August 2, 2008, FBI agents used a simple trick to draw him out of his Baltimore apartment. They told him his catamaran was taking on water down at the marina. The moment he stepped outside to check on it, agents surrounded him. His daughter was found safe, unharmed. But figuring out who he actually was took time. It wasn't until August 15th that the FBI, along with Massachusetts State and Boston Police and the Suffolk County Prosecutor's Office, announced they had used forensic analysis at the FBI's Quantico lab to confirm his true identity: Christian Karl Gerhartsreiter, a German-born man who had entered the country as a teenager back in 1978 and had spent the next 3 decades building an entirely fabricated American life. In June 2009, he was convicted of kidnapping his daughter and sentenced to up to 5 years in prison. But that was just the beginning of what investigators were now looking into. Remember those bones found under a San Marino backyard back in 1994? In 2011, advances in DNA testing finally allowed investigators to identify them. They belonged to John Sohus, the young man who had once lived in the main house, while a mysterious tenant calling himself Christopher Chichester lived in the guest house out back. The tenant who vanished at the exact same time John and his wife disappeared. The tenant who was later seen driving John's car. The tenant who, it turned out, was the same person now sitting in custody as Christian Gerhartsreiter. In March 2011, he was formally charged in connection with John Sohus's death. 2 years later, in April 2013, a jury convicted him of first-degree murder. That August, he was sentenced to 27 years to life for killing the son of the woman who had once simply rented him a small guest house in her backyard, all the way back in 1985. As for Linda Sohus, John's wife, she was never found. To this day, her disappearance remains unresolved. For nearly 30 years, a man built an entire life out of borrowed names and invented histories, and somehow, almost no one thought to ask where he'd really come from. Maybe the real question worth sitting with tonight isn't how he fooled so many people for so long. It's how many of us would ask the right questions, even if the answers were standing right in front of us. That's it for tonight's story. Thank you for listening. If you liked following this one, take a look at the rest of the channel, because there's plenty more like it with new stories on the way. And if there's something you'd like me to cover next, or any thoughts about tonight's episode, leave them down in the comments. This was Sleep to Stories. Good night, and sleep well.